I had been a nurse at Greystone Hospital for nearly 5 years when I first heard the rumors about the silent ward. Nurses spoke of it only in hushed whispers, mostly during the night shifts when the hospital was eerily quiet and the empty hallways seemed to stretch forever. It was Ward 7, they said, long abandoned and hidden away on the top floor of the hospital. The stories always fascinated me, but I never believed them. They claimed that Ward 7 used to house patients with severe mental illnesses. People said it was closed down after strange and unexplainable events started happening. Patients vanishing without a trace, strange noises coming from the walls, and shadows moving where no one should be. It was just the kind of ghost story nurses like to share to make the long, cold nights seem a little less boring. One night, during a particularly slow shift, I sat in the break room with Martha, an older nurse who had worked at Greystone for decades. She was one of the few who had been around when Ward was still in use. I decided to ask her about it, hoping for a good story to pass the time. "So Martha," I began casually, "you were here when Ward 7 was still open, right? What's the real story behind it?" Martha's eyes darkened, and she glanced around the room as if to make sure no one else was listening. She leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ward 7 is not something you want to mess with, Emily. There's a reason they closed it down and sealed it off. It's cursed." I smiled, thinking she was exaggerating, but her expression was dead serious. "Cursed? Really?" Martha nodded slowly. "I'm not one for ghost stories, but I saw things up there with my own eyes. Doors slamming on their own, lights flickering even though the power was fine, and the patients. They would scream at night, swearing they could see people walking through the walls." A chill ran down my spine. The hospital was old, sure, and it creaked and groaned like any ancient building, but the way Martha spoke made it seem like there was something darker at play. Still, I was skeptical. "But it's just an old ward, right? They probably shut it down because the patients needed better care elsewhere." Martha shook her head. "It wasn't just the patients. One night, a doctor went up there alone to check on a patient who had been screaming for hours. He never came back. They searched everywhere, but it was like he disappeared into thin air. After that, the ward was shut down." I laughed, nervously, unsure of whether she was trying to scare me or if she truly believed what she was saying. "So what? He's still up there, wandering the halls like a ghost?" She didn't laugh. "I wouldn't go up there if I were you, Emily. Leave it be." For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that her words had left me with. But I was curious. Ward 7 had been sealed off for years, but I knew there had to be a way to get up there. The hospital was a maze of old hallways and stairwells, some of which were barely used anymore. I figured that if I explored a bit, I might be able to find a way in. The next night, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to stay late after my shift and explore. It was past midnight when I made my way up the stairs to the top floor, my heart pounding in my chest. The hospital was deathly silent, save for the occasional beep of a heart monitor or the distant echo of footsteps down the hall. When I reached the top floor, I was met with a long, dimly lit corridor. At the far end of the hallway, a rusty metal door stood slightly ajar. A sign next to it read, "Ward 7 Restricted Access." My heart raced with a mix of excitement and fear as I approached the door. Pushing it open, I was met with the smell of stale air and dust. The lights inside flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The ward looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Old hospital beds were lined up along the walls, their sheets yellowed with age. The windows were covered in grime, and the air was cold, unnaturally so. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I walked down the row of beds, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Then I heard it, a soft whisper. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like it was coming from the far end of the ward. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The whispering stopped. I took a deep breath and continued walking, my eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the flickering light. It was a man, dressed in a hospital gown, his back to me. His head hung low, and his arms dangled lifelessly at his sides. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't move. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my ears. "Sir?" Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, and the figure turned around. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide and empty. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, a low guttural moan filled the air, sending a wave of terror through me. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The figure began to move toward me, slowly at first, then faster, his footsteps echoing through the empty ward. Panicking, I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the dusty floor. I could hear him behind me, his breathing heavy and uneven. The exit was just ahead, but it felt like it was miles away. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning with effort. Finally, I reached the door and slammed it shut behind me, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. The moment the door clicked into place, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart racing. I waited, listening for any signs that the figure had followed me. But there was nothing. Slowly, I backed away from the door, my hands still shaking. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I sprinted down the hallway and didn't stop until I reached the stairwell. As I descended the stairs, I glanced back one last time. The door to ward stood closed, but I could have sworn I saw a shadow move behind the small window in the door. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw that night. Who would believe me? The hospital was old and full of strange noises. It could have been my imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about the incident, but something kept pulling me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ward 7 than just an old ghost story. I needed answers. So one night, I found myself back at the entrance to the ward. This time, I wasn't alone. I had convinced two of my colleagues, Sarah and Jake, to come with me. They didn't believe in the stories, but they were curious, just like me. "We'll just take a quick look and leave," I assured them as we approached the door. Sarah rolled her eyes. "I still think this is a waste of time. It's just an old ward. Nothing's up there." Jake nodded in agreement, though he looked a little nervous. Still, they followed me as I pushed the door open once more. The ward looked just as it had before, cold, dark, and abandoned. But something felt different this time. The air was heavier, thicker, like we were being watched. "Let's just hurry up and get this over with," Jake muttered, his eyes darting around the room. We walked down the row of beds, our footsteps echoing in the silence.